It's our end of the year episode, and we're hitting three key areas in politics. We'll dive into the city of Jacksonville's big current issues. What does the future hold for the president, the former president, and the presidential hopeful from Florida? Plus, Sunshine State lawmakers will head back to the Capitol to start the new year. It's our Hand on Government edition on This Week in Jacksonville. Excited you are here and excited to host Chris Tan for our monthly episode called Hand on Government. Government law attorney. And Chris, I love that your experience is in local and state and federal. And so let's start local today. Sure. Jacksonville Mayor Donna Deegan recently with City Council agreeing to fund most of her transition initiatives. So some $26 million here. Public health, housing, youth programs. What does this tell us about the mayor and city council being able to work together?
Well, Kent, first of all, I think very important that every new mayoral administration start with several high-profile wins, and this is certainly that for Mayor Deegan and her administration. Just to remind viewers of kind of how this came about, during the budget process that started on July the 15th and wrapped up at the end of September, City Council set aside $26 million, actually $27 million, at the mayor's request to be able to fund recommendations from her transition committees. Mayor Deegan had a very extensive transition process, really leaning into citizen engagement, trying to give citizens an opportunity to help make recommendations for the future of Jacksonville. She had 7 different transition teams, more than 200 citizens involved in that process, and they released a series of recommendations on challenges facing Jacksonville and solutions they'd like to see implemented to help address some of those challenges. Mayor Deegan's bill, which was a $27 million bill, City Council reduced it by $1 million to $26 million, addressed a lot of the issues you talked about, whether it was homelessness, affordable housing, public health, for example, food insecurity. So there's a variety of transition committee recommendations that have now been funded. City Council passed it at its last meeting of the year. Mayor Deegan signed it the next day. So the city of Jacksonville will now be moving to implement some of those recommendations going forward.
Chris, this process, it seems like demands collaboration, right?
Sure, of course.
Who's the key here? Is it the council president, the finance committee chair? Is it a blend of those?
Well, I think it's a variety of keys to the process. One is the mayor and her team having a vision for what they want accomplished, being able to bring a proposal to the city council that's well defined. So that's sort of piece one. Piece two is the council president, who really sets the tone for the culture of that year's council, for the way that council does business, the way it operates, the way it works with the mayor's office. City Council President Ron Salem has been somewhat collaborative in the way he's approached his job. And then, of course, there are other key members like the finance chair and the finance members, because any appropriations bill goes through the finance committee, but also all 19 members of the council. There's a former mayor who used to say, you can't do anything without 10 votes. So it's really a process for every mayor's office to identify what each council member's interests are, what their likes and dislikes are, what they're going to focus on, what they're not going to focus on, and go use that process to try and gather 10 votes for a bill. In this case, Mayor Deegan and her team actually identified 13 votes for her bill as it passed by an overwhelming majority.
I want to talk a little bit about some redevelopment and a plan downtown. So City Council heard a proposal this week for $36 million in incentives for a new Laura Street Trio plan. So Chris, maybe first explain, as we're looking at this video here, explain the Laura Street Trio and why it's like this nostalgic part of downtown.
Well, for anyone who's a fan of the novel Moby Dick, the Laura Street Trio is sort of the white whale of downtown revitalization. It's been a proposal that's been around for almost a couple of decades now to revitalize these 3 historic buildings right in the heart of downtown Jacksonville. Remember, the Great Fire of 1901 basically destroyed most of center Jacksonville. These are 3 buildings that were constructed in the decade after the Great Fire of 1901, the Florida Life Building, the Bisbee Building, and the Marble Bank Building, 2 of which were designed by Jacksonville's famed architect Henry Clutho. So they do have great historic significance. Over the last 15 to 20 years, the city of Jacksonville has been trying to figure out how to revitalize and redevelop these buildings. For the last decade or so, have been working with a group called Southeast Development, Steve Atkins, who bought the property, the 3 buildings in 2013, and has been trying to kind of work with the city to identify a public-private partnership that would help to redevelop the property. So it's gone through several iterations. There have been a variety of proposals over the last decade to deal with this. This most recent recent one would involve about $180 million redevelopment of the three buildings, where there'd be a four-star hotel, there'd be about 150 apartments, some retail and restaurants there as well. And the city is being asked to invest about a third of that cost, $60 million, through a series of loans, both traditional loans and forgivable loans, and also through some tax abatements. So it is a very significant investment. That's why City Council seems to be taking its time. This was introduced in December. It was introduced as an emergency, but Council decided to defer that debate to January so they can consider all the different finances of the project before making a decision about whether the city's going to invest in it.
And before we move on, part of those incentives, we talked about the loan, there's a $22 million loan from the city. Councilmember Matt Carlucci says, hey, if this all goes well, he's a proponent of this project. If it goes well, it would invigorate downtown redevelopment. Is this a key to seeing other projects happen in downtown?
Well, I think one of the reasons Laura Street Trio advocates have been so enthusiastic about it is not only the ability to revitalize these historic buildings, but also because it's right in the core of downtown, where the buildings are located, right in the middle of downtown. And the hope of advocates of the Laura Street Trio is that this revitalization will in turn generate momentum that builds revitalization throughout the core of downtown. We've seen revitalization on the South Bank. We've seen it in Brooklyn, but it's been a little slow in developing right in the core of downtown. The hope is that the Trio is a catalyst for that center city development.
We're going to shift topics a little bit here. Changes coming this coming year concerning Duval County and voting. Returning Supervisor of Elections Jerry Holland back after 8 years in a different constitutional office for the City of Jacksonville. But he wanted fewer voting precincts, more early voting sites, some newer equipment when he came back in and his budget proposal. What are your, in your view, what are the big changes that may be coming in 2024?
Well, I think the biggest change is consensus rather than controversy on the issue of early voting sites. People may recall, you know, it used to be, Kent, that everybody voted on Election Day itself. Well, we've obviously changed dramatically in the way we vote. Between voting by mail and early voting, many, if not most people, vote before Election Day. So where those sites are placed, how convenient they are to people is very, very important. Prior to supervisor elections, Holland coming back into office, there had been a lot of public debate and discussion about that. Voting access advocates and the prior supervisors of elections had some disagreement as to where those early voting sites should be located. Supervisor Holland came back into office and worked with some of those voting rights advocates to come up with a consensus plan. So there will now be 24 early voting sites across City of Jacksonville, Duval County during the 2024 election, including one on the campus of Edward Waters University in Northwest Jacksonville, which had been a source of some debate during the previous supervisor administration. So again, collaboration and consensus came together. There will now be 24 sites available during the March presidential preference primary, during the August regular primary, and of course during the November general election.
Yeah, in general, we want to see as many people as possible vote.
Absolutely.
Who are, you know, participating in government here. All right, so stay with us, and then we're turning our attention to the battles taking place on a national stage. Presidential politics and foreign policy. We'll dive into that next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
We continue our Hand on Government episode today, and Chris Hand with us. Let's talk about what's happened on the national scene, 2024 presidential election year. Associated Press, NORC Center for Public Affairs Research. So new poll, we already knew a little bit of that. People are not excited about a potential rematch between President Biden and former President Trump. And this data says that there's not much enthusiasm about voting because of that matchup. So let's start here. What's going on the Democratic side? Where does the Democratic Party go? Because President Biden, the incumbent, natural presumed nominee, but also struggling with some approval ratings.
Well, to your earlier point, Kent, you know, it used to be back in the day that people didn't love summer reruns. Well, for people who don't like reruns, get ready, because there's going to probably be one in the fall of 2024, a rerun of the 2020 presidential election. But I think what you're seeing is a very, and this has become very common in American politics, a very closely contested election. There are polls out there that show former President Trump leading. There are some others that show former President Biden leading. And some of the key polls are in those key battleground battleground states, the states whose electoral votes really in most cases decide who the election's going to be. So, at this point you have an unusual situation in American politics that you have the equivalent of almost two incumbent presidents running against each other. This is an incumbent, Joe Biden, but his predecessor and Donald Trump also running. So you don't see that a lot. But every piece of data we're seeing right now is that the 2024 election is going to be close like the 2020 election was or the 2016 election was.
Is there something to that notion of voter fatigue, or is it just everyone has political fatigue because it's so contentious?
Well, I think the contentiousness is certainly an issue. Also an issue is the nonstop nature of it. Because of the way the political system has evolved, political cultures have evolved, we rarely get a break from talking about the presidential contest. Once that's done, we're now into the midterm elections. And of course, sort of the way the culture's changed in places like Washington and even some state governments, we often see a lot of this sort of contentious politics and governing happening. So I think one of the reasons in fatigue is if you keep doing something for a long time, you never get a break from it, you get tired. Well, that's, I think, certainly what's happening right now as well.
So let me ask about the phrase Bidenomics. So the president, when he started out on the campaign trail, and hey, here's Bidenomics. Does it make a difference for voters? Is this an issue that is drawing in the base that he wants to appeal to?
Well, I think it's just axiomatic in every presidential election that the most important issue is the economy. It always comes down to that. But what's important is not just what the economic numbers say, but what are voters' perceptions of the economy? If it is good economic news, are they feeling that good economic news in terms of their job security, their quality of life, their disposable income, those sorts of issues? What's interesting about what the Biden administration is dealing with is a lot of the sort of top-line economic numbers in terms of job creation and some of those issues are pretty positive for the Biden administration. But obviously something the country has gone through during his presidency is inflation, significant inflation for the first time really since the 1980s. What's going to be, I think, a key factor in determining what happens in 2024. Inflation numbers are coming down. They're kind of coming back to earth after a long period of time. The question by next November is, are Americans going to perceive that? Are they going to feel that prices have come back to what they view to be a more reasonable level? If not, that's probably a challenge for President Biden. If they do, that's probably helpful in his reelection bid. But those, again, economic numbers matter a lot. Economic perceptions matter a lot more.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so on the Republican side, there are several candidates, and the list is whittling down a little bit because as soon as we get into 2024, here we come with a caucus and a primary, and where do things stand on that side of the...
Well, Kay, you're right. It's going to come fast and furious in 2024. The first contest in mid-January in Iowa. That'll be followed by New Hampshire and states like South Carolina. And then ultimately in March, we'll get to here in Florida. What we're seeing in poll after poll, we talked about data earlier, is that Republicans seem inclined to nominate the same candidate that they did in 2020 and in 2016, and that's Donald Trump. He has massive leads in all of these early state polls. The Des Moines Register, just in the past week or so, released the very well-known and respected Iowa poll, which shows him with about a more than 30-point lead over Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in the Iowa caucuses. In New Hampshire, he has a similar lead of about 30 points over his competitors. In fact, in that one, Governor DeSantis is actually fourth behind President Trump. Former South Carolina Governor and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. And then even in the state of Florida, where Ron DeSantis is governor, he was reelected in 2022 by a 20-point margin. Even there, in polls both in November and now in December, show former President Trump leading him somewhere in the margin of about 40 points. So again, as the old saying goes, the only poll that counts is the one on election day. So voters will actually make this decision. But based on the data we have now, it sure looks like a third Republican presidential nomination for Donald Trump.
Yeah, let's wrap up this segment on this topic, foreign aid and foreign policy, I guess. It seems like that is at a higher level than I remember for maybe 20 years. Does that play into what's we're going to see in 2024? The idea that America is giving vast resources to Israel, to Ukraine, maybe other places in the future?
Well, I think what you see in a lot of public opinion, Ken, is that Americans by and large have been supportive of the assistance that we've provided, for example, to Israel, which suffered a horrific terrorist attack on October 7th, and also to Ukraine, which again was the victim of a unprovoked, unprecedented attack by Russia, more than a year ago at this point, and the support we've been providing there. So what's interesting there is kind of maybe less the sort of public issues, although that will certainly play in to the presidential elections. There are people with strong feelings on all sides of those issues, but I think also for how we watch Congress and the White House work together. That's a big issue right now. Will the divided Congress, with the Senate controlled by the Democrats and the House controlled by Republicans, will they pass a supplemental aid package that provides needed support to Israel and to the Ukraine? And that is now being tied to an issue of what's happening at the southern border of the U.S. and Mexico. So it's sort of typical of an appropriations bill, a lot of seemingly unrelated issues coming together. The next couple of weeks are going to be decisive in figuring out if the White House and both houses of Congress can come together on a consensus supplemental appropriations bill.
A lot of conversations about, you'll have my yes vote if my thing gets handled. All right, so stay with us, and we're going to turn the focus to what's happening in state politics as the legislative session in Florida opens up right after the holidays. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Chris Hand here with us. State lawmakers, they've got a holiday break, and then they get right into the new legislative session. I believe it's January 9th, so coming up very soon in 2024. Sir, some of the priorities you see the Senate and the House working on?
Well, Ken, remember, every even-numbered year, the legislature starts in January as opposed to March, so that's what we're seeing happen in 2024. But looks like a pretty full plate for the legislature. One issue there seems to be a lot of consensus about the legislature taking action on is health care. There have been studies done, for example, by the legislature's policy arm, which is known as OPAGA, that show that there could be an 18,000 person deficit of physicians in the state of Florida by 2035, both because of the way the state is growing and the way the population is living longer. So they're projecting that Florida won't have nearly the number of physicians and other medical providers that it needs in 2035. There's already been great concerns about a nursing shortage here in the state of Florida. So that seems to be one effort that the legislature, particularly State Senator Kathleen Passidomo, is going to be focusing on this year. How do we increase the number of doctors in Florida?
What can a lawmaker do about that? I mean, what can the legislature say? Hey, we've identified the problem, but how do you create a solution there?
Well, I think what you're seeing is a variety of solutions come forward. For example, in the House, there's been a bill filed by a state representative who's a doctor from the Panhandle area who would eliminate non-competes in contracts for physicians. Right now, Kent, if a physician enters a large physician group and then wants to leave, might be somewhat limited in where he or she can go practice after that. So there's one bill out there that would eliminate those so-called non-compete agreements as part of physician contracts. Like I said, Senate President Passidomo has come up with what's called the Live Healthy Act, which would take a variety of steps, which would increase the number of residency slots here in the state of Florida so that more doctors after they have finished medical school can do their residency here in the state. Also make it easier for qualified foreign-born doctors to practice here in the state of Florida. Create new pathways for clinical experiences. Obviously, one of the most important pieces of training for anyone who goes into medicine is those hands-on opportunities to learn how to treat patients, to work with patients, to empathize with patients. And so the bill would also do that. So it's a bill that's, again, not just a policy bill, it's an appropriations bill that also appropriates a significant amount of money. State Senate President Passidomo has already indicated this is her major priority for the 2024 session. And like I said, we're seeing activities on both sides of the Capitol, both at the Senate and the House, to help deal with this physician and medical provider shortage.
It is could be a crisis. So, hey, I don't know if we'll get beyond this, but I definitely want to talk about child labor laws. I saw there's a sponsor of a bill about making 16 and 17-year-olds be able to work overnight on a school nights and things like that.
Well, this is a matter of great controversy in the legislature. There's a proposal right now before the legislature that would change Florida's child labor laws. Right now, if you are a 16 or 17-year-old, you're not permitted by law to work more than 6 consecutive days without a day off, and also not permitted to work more than 4 hours at a time without at least a 30-minute meal break. Now, every state has a different set of child labor laws and different regulations as it relates to children working. The federal government has its own set as well. So this is a proposal that's been made to try, the bill advocates have said what they want to do is give 16 and 17-year-olds more workforce development opportunities while also providing people, especially in the retail and hospitality industry, more flexibility in who they can hire and who they can employ in these practices. And there have been those who oppose these bills who are concerned that children could be taken advantage of in these situations, that it's not contributing to their health, might detract from their education. So this is going to be a pretty, I think, significant debate over the next several months and during the legislative session. Will Florida's child labor laws change in 2024? We'll have to wait and see the bills that have been proposed, kind of what course they take through the process.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Chris. And I know that other things come up, but certainly these lawmakers have been working. They've been in Tallahassee, committee weeks, all of that leading through the fall up to what we'll see in the start of the year. Thank you so much, Best, for the holidays. And for the next 2 Sundays, we are taking a break during this holiday season. Our next new episode will air January 7th. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17. And you find us online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. And don't miss our new version of This Week in Jacksonville called Business Edition. It's a podcast. We focus on economic development in the River City. This week's episode looks at warehousing and how that industry's local growth can deliver big results in the region.
See why every day more people are choosing News 4 Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.